Hello, everyone. This video will go over Chapter 6, which focuses on ethical concerns of journalists and media writers. So in Chapter 5, we really looked at a lot of the legal aspects of media writing. So what's the difference between legal concerns and ethical concerns? Legal concerns are those standards that are set by government laws. So in order to understand what is right and wrong legally, you would look at written law. The government is the one that enforces violations of legal principles, both through policing and through our court system. Ethical standards, on the other hand, are set by individuals, organizations, and society as a whole. When you're questioning whether something is ethically correct, you look at human right and wrongs. It's the feeling inside of what you consider to be acceptable. A lot of ethical standards are enforced by the profession and organization and then have to be considered at the individual level as well. So here are some examples of legal concerns versus ethical concerns. As we talked about last week, things like privacy, trespassing, libel, slander, crossing police boundaries, assault, those would be legal concerns, where ethical concerns would be things like plagiarism, not being transparent in your work, harming someone with your work, whether you're doing so purposefully or not taking care and attention in your writing, and not reporting the truth. Ethical standards, as I've previously said, are usually set by an organization, an industry, a community, or society. But then you have to measure ethical principles against your own morals. So you have to be okay with the ethical things that you do in order for you to go home at night and look at yourself in the mirror. Some ethical codes of conduct are explicit or written, such as the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, which is probably the most comprehensive, explicit document of ethical standards for journalists. Some ethical standards, however, are implicit. They're not written down. They're just understood principles of our field. And you need to discuss with your newsroom leaders, your editors, and other journalists what those ethical principles might be. Now, the organizations that typically have explicit written down standards are the Society for Professional Journalists, the Association for Newspaper Editors. Photographers within the MPPA have ethical standards, particularly for photojournalists, and then RTDNA is for broadcast news, television, and radio. And so you can look at their codes of ethics as you begin work in those industries. Now, there are many ethical questions, and your textbook kind of walks you through each of these in great depth. But here are some things that you need to be asking yourself as you're working as a journalist. Who will be hurt and how many? Who will be helped and how many? And so essentially you're asking, does the good outweigh the bad with your work? You should always know the purpose or objective of your story and whether or not your writing is contributing to that purpose or objective. If it's not, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. What do we usually do is a good question to ask yourself to judge against the standards of the industry, but sometimes what we normally do is not a good policy, and we'll give some examples later on in this video of when that is the case. So you need to ask yourself, am I okay with working under this policy? Is it something that needs to change? You can also ask, is there a better alternative to my actions? And when I go home at night, will I be able to stomach doing this? Can I defend myself? Could I call my grandma up and tell her what I did and still feel okay about it? What are the values that I can apply, whether that's truth or honesty, care and compassion for other people? Those values need to be applied to your actions as well. Is this the kind of journalism that I really want to produce? Is this something I feel proud of? And most importantly, is this the person I want to be? And I think that is one of the best ethical questions you can ask yourself, because sometimes we just forget to look in the mirror and say, am I okay with this? because that can guide a lot of our ethical decision making. So your textbook provides the Potter box, which is a table of things that you can ask yourself as you go along. This could be a quick reference guide when you get in sticky situations to help you make decisions about what is ethically uh, correct in your actions as a media writer. Unethical behavior is really important because unethical behavior hurts journalists professionally. I think about Brian Williams, who, when I was growing up, was, one of the top network journalists. Well, when he claimed to have witnessed certain things during wartime activities when he really didn't, it really hurt his reputation personally and professionally as a journalist. And while he still works, he's a correspondent for MSNBC now, it really hurt him professionally, and he could have seen great growth in the industry if he had not done that. It also hurts your organization's credibility and the industry overall because people start doubting the credibility of what you're doing. And then most importantly, you as an individual will have a hard time dealing with unethical behavior in your moral and personal life. I think it's really hard when you're not doing what you consider to be the right thing to go home and sleep every night. I know even things that I was doing with my work for nonprofits and hospitals, while overall very good, if I did not feel comfortable with what I was being asked to do, it was very hard for me to kind of grapple with that and do it. And so I actually left a particular job when I felt like I was not being asked to do the ethically right thing, although there was certainly nothing legally wrong with what they were asking me to do. So there are many different types of ethical issues that we as media writers need to pay attention to. I think we've talked about plagiarism throughout the semester, and it keeps coming up because it is an issue within our industry, and it is something you need to be concerned about, both with your academic life and your professional life. Remember all the different kinds of plagiarism that we've talked about: stealing work, quoting and not crediting, or even making up information. And sadly, this happens a lot even today. You can see the difference, or similarities rather, between Melania Trump's 2016 speech and a lot of the words that she either requoted or directly stole from Michelle Obama's speech in 2008. Sourcing is also an ethical concern a lot of times. You want to make sure that you are using anonymous and confidential sources in the proper way. A lot of organizations will have rules on when you can use confidential sources, but as much as possible, you want to identify your sources so that there's nothing kind of unseemly going on. In addition, I think we as journalists have an ethical responsibility to balance different points of view so that we are not biased in the way that we write, and properly representing diverse communities within our sourcing decisions. We shouldn't be interviewing friends or relatives because it's a conflict of interest, and it can be very difficult to do so objectively. This is also why we shouldn't become too friendly with sources, especially those officials who are very important, because it can keep us from wanting to report things when things go badly. Recording, we talked a little bit about within our privacy section. Remember, you want to avoid secret recording, even if your state is a one-party record state. And make sure you always have editor approval when trying to record a conversation, as well as the source's approval as much as possible. You want to avoid conflicts of interest, and this happens a lot in various different fashions with journalists. The first conflict of interest that is probably the most common is gifts. A lot of times organizations or companies will send the news station or journalist free things to try to sway them in their work. Typically, you should never accept a gift that is more than $15. And you want to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest by, accepting free meals or things like that. So use your best judgment when accepting gifts, but also pay attention to any state laws you may have on this, as well as organizational policies. Junkets used to be a lot more common. Obviously, junkets are not happening hardly at all during COVID-19, but junkets are when a organization offers a media trip for the media to come and experience something cool or unique, and they pay for it. Now, this sounds fabulous as a journalist, right? But the problem is you can never truly be objective if someone is paying your way. If you were being paid to go on a trip and experience this awesome hotel, would you really be willing to say something negative about it? So anytime that you're accepting something for free in exchange for your media writing, make sure you disclose that you were paid to do so, and try to avoid those free trips as much as possible. You also want to avoid becoming the story. You may be familiar with a woman on the right, this Megyn Kelly from Fox News, and she has become the story, so to speak, in many different cases. For instance, in interviewing President Donald Trump during the election, he said some things about her that then had to be debated within the actual journalistic news cycle. And so, can Megyn Kelly really report as an objective journalist if she's reporting about Megyn Kelly? But on the alternative end, Megyn Kelly was able to speak out against sexual harassment within Fox News, which obviously was a part of the news story. But that was an important way that she became the story by identifying herself as someone who had been victimized within that harassment. So again, it's not always that you can't become the story, but when you become the story, you should really be able to step away and not report in a way that might have a conflict of interest. Also, I know a lot of journalists try to freelance because unfortunately, journalists don't make a whole lot of money. So you try to pick up side gigs, and as media professionals, we can be hired for many different purposes. However, keep in mind that many organizations will have you sign non-compete clauses, meaning that any of your work cannot go to competitors. And that can be defined very narrowly, like you can't produce news for any other local television station within your market, or it can be very broadly, meaning that you can't do anything for anyone. So make sure you check with your organization before you begin freelancing. Objectivity is also critically important, as we've discussed throughout the whole semester. So when thinking about it ethically, you need to make sure that you examine your own bias. And as much as possible, we as journalists should not disclose our personal beliefs on, especially on political issues. This woman to the right is someone that I've worked with, I respect and admire. It's Pam Huff of ABC 3340. And whenever she speaks on this topic to students or journalists generally, she talks about having to cover a death penalty case where she actually watched an inmate be put to death and how that really affected her emotionally and personally. However, after she reported this story, she got a lot of hate mail from both sides, people who supported the death penalty and said that she didn't, show her support enough for it, as well as people who are against the death penalty and really kind of got onto her for seeming like she supported it. So a lot of times when you as a journalist are getting hate mail from both sides of the spectrum of political beliefs, it means you're doing your job. It means you're really reporting in the middle, because some people think you're supporting, some people think you're not supporting enough. And then so that is the sign of a good journalist. And something Pam says is that she will go to her grave never disclosing whether or not she supports the death penalty, because that's her personal belief and it should never influence her ability to tell a story. So I encourage you, as you are becoming young media professionals, watch what you say on social media. because a lot of times when you're disclosing your personal political beliefs on social media or in documented ways, it can color and bias your future reporting and ability to report objectively, because someone can go back, see what you really believe on a topic, and then use it against your claims for objectivity. So be considering that as you're posting and as you're expressing things. I'm not telling you not to express political beliefs at all, because there are certainly some things that I speak out for that I very strongly believe in. But overall, I try to remain fairly neutral and objective on my platforms. Interviewing victims is one of the hardest parts of being a journalist. Having covered many crises myself personally, I know that this is extremely difficult to do. The main thing that you want to keep in mind when interviewing victims is to do no harm. We don't want to cause this victim to have further harm or be re-traumatized by having to really relive that experience. Remember, an interview is always the victim's decision. They are not required to speak to the media, so don't ever push them beyond where they want to be. And even if they agree to an interview, don't push them for information they're not wanting to disclose or don't feel comfortable doing. And as always, just be a kind, compassionate human. When you can see that someone is hurting, offer to turn off the camera. Offer to take a pause. Always, people are more important than stories. And that's something we should ethically consider for all stories, but especially when dealing with victims. Now, reporting during disasters is its own special ethical quandary for journalists. The primary thing you need to remember if you're reporting during active disaster, whether that's man-made, such as a school shooting, or a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado, you need to stay out of the way. You as a journalist should be an observer and should not be getting involved as much as possible. You need to allow the first responders to do their job. If at all possible, you should try to help police during active situations so that if you're getting information that maybe that officer doesn't have, I suggest that you help the police to disclose that information. Now, not everyone is going to do that. That's actually an ethical question you can ask yourself. But I always say try to help the investigation as much as humanly possible. You also want to help someone who is not being helped as much as you can. I have arrived to scenes of car crashes or house fires before firefighters, before police officers ever arrived. And if I can help a person who is undergoing some kind of trauma, I will. For instance, I was actually on a story as a field producer, and someone and it wasn't a crisis story by any means, it was a regular everyday story, and someone near me fell down and was having a heart attack. They needed CPR. Well, I've been CPR trained, and so I went and helped that person. And then there were questions after the incident of whether I overstepped my boundaries, as a journalist by helping that person. I always suggest that helping someone and trying to save a life is never, it's something that I ethically consider to be correct in all times. People first, stories second. But again, you should not be trying to help someone if they've already received help, because that gets in the way of letting first responders do their job. Most important, or not most important, but something to always keep in mind is that you have to keep yourself safe. Journalism can be very dangerous work. And again, your safety always comes first. If your station is asking you to go out in the middle of a hurricane and stand in hurricane force winds just to get some cool imagery, don't do it if you do not feel safe. That is always first and foremost. Don't give away information that could harm someone during active scenes either. Something that happened during the Columbine shootings was students were calling in on their mobile phones to the news stations, and the news stations were covering those interviews live on air. Well, what they didn't realize was that the shooters could have been listening to those reports and giving away the location of people who were trying to hide within the school during the active shooting. So these are all things that you really need to think about as you are doing your work during crisis. Another thing that we as the media need to consider is whether or not we should give fame and publicity to those who have done things that are terrible. Here's an opinion piece. So you can see how ethically difficult covering something like a mass shooting could be. This is also why journalists are encouraged not to report on suicides because of the copycat effect. So suicides are something that the media typically does not cover unless it is of public concern. We should also consider when to use names in other types of cases, such as investigations that involve juveniles, whether that juvenile is the perpetrator of a crime or the victim. Typically, media outlets do not include the names of juveniles. In addition, we have to be particularly careful with sexual assault victims and identifying them because most of these people want to remain anonymous. In fact, during the Kavanaugh investigation, a senator, in trying to stand up for victims of sexual assault, accidentally or says she accidentally identified victims without their permission in an ad. So these are great concerns that we would have as media writers in trying to protect the privacy of victims. One of the great debates happening right now in journalism is over the use of mugshots in crime reporting. A lot of times we use mugshots for various purposes to just provide an image along with our coverage of a particular crime. It may be that you're using a mugshot as police are searching for someone. So to what extent should we be using mugshots and other identifying information of people who have been arrested? The reasons for this are that mugshots in media are long lasting. So is someone being arrested and then having a funny mugshot photo worth them losing a lifetime of professional credibility over? A lot of people argue that we also need to provide context for all of the cases. So if you're using a mugshot, then you actually have to have a story that accompanies it, identifying why that person was arrested and in what context. And then also, please note that there's a large racial disparity in the way that journalists use mugshots. It is far more common for a journalist to use a mugshot of a Black male than of a white male. So examine your own bias. There are many other considerations that we have to make in terms of ethics. Avoid deceit, avoid speculation when you don't know whether something is true. We need to avoid sensationalism. Try to avoid altering photos, even if you think it's for clarity. Changing what really happened through editing of photos can be very difficult as well. We have to consider the implications of certain things, even if someone is a public figure or celebrity. For instance, does disclosing someone's extramarital affair really affect their public service? It's a question, so you need to examine that ethically. We also need to consider whether it's okay to report rumors and to what degree. And then also, if we are promoting a product or advertising something and promoting it as news or fact, that is ethically questionable as well. So now that we've talked about various ethics for the field, I want you to go into the discussion post, which will be an ethics case study. Then you'll complete Chapter 4, Exercise 4 within your workbook, which will be due on Monday, and then work on your AP style homework, which will be on capitalization.